I was only 16 when I first heard about the whistling forest. Our village, Kihora, was small, nestled at the edge of the forest, surrounded by rolling hills and the constant hum of cicadas. It was a quiet place, where everyone knew each other, and stories passed down through generations were as important as the air we breathed. One such story was about the whistling forest, a place we were forbidden to enter. The elders would say, "Do not follow the whispers, and do not answer the call of the trees." They claimed the forest was alive, its spirits watching, waiting for those foolish enough to wander in after dark. Some said it was a sacred place, a bridge between our world and the spirit realm. Others whispered that it was cursed, the final resting place of souls who had been wronged. Whatever the truth was, the warnings were clear: stay out. But like most young people, my friends and I dismissed these tales as mere superstition. It was all too easy to laugh about spirits and curses when the sun was shining and the world felt safe. That changed one fateful evening. It was during the Harvest Festival, a time when the entire village gathered to celebrate the season's bounty. The air was filled with the aroma of roasted maize and groundnut stew, and the sound of drums echoed through the hills. My friends, Amani, Wanja, and I, decided to sneak away from the festivities to explore the edge of the whistling forest. It was meant to be a harmless adventure, a chance to prove that we weren't afraid of ghost stories. As we approached the forest, the lively sounds of the festival faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees stood tall and still, their gnarled branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Wanja was the first to notice it, a faint, melodic whistling coming from deep within the woods. It was unlike anything we had ever heard, a tune both haunting and strangely beautiful. "It's just the wind," Amani said, though his voice trembled. "Nothing to be afraid of." But I wasn't so sure. The whistling felt deliberate, as if someone, or something, was calling to us. Despite my unease, curiosity got the better of me. We stepped closer, just past the tree line. The air grew colder, and the scent of earth and moss filled my nostrils. The whistling grew louder, weaving through the trees like a living thing. "Let's go back," I whispered, my heart pounding. But Wanja, ever the bold one, laughed. "What's the matter? Afraid of a little song?" she teased before walking further into the forest. Amani hesitated, but then followed her. I didn't want to be left alone, so I reluctantly trailed behind them. The deeper we went, the more surreal everything became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like grasping hands. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from all around us. "Do you hear that?" Amani asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just one whistle." He was right. It sounded like dozens of voices, each carrying the same tune, but slightly out of sync. Panic set in as I realized we couldn't tell which direction we had come from. The forest seemed to shift and change, the once familiar landmarks now unrecognizable. "We need to go back," I said firmly, grabbing Wanja's arm. But she shook me off. "Look!" she exclaimed, pointing ahead. In the distance, faint lights flickered like fireflies. "Maybe someone's there. They can help us." Against my better judgment, we followed her. The lights danced just out of reach, drawing us deeper into the forest. The whistling grew deafening, and my fear turned to dread. I felt as if we were being watched, unseen eyes tracking our every move. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk scarred with strange markings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air around it was heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The whistling stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. "What is this place?" Amani whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a shadow moved at the base of the tree. It took the shape of a figure, tall and indistinct, its edges shifting like smoke. My chest tightened as the figure raised an arm, pointing directly at us. "Why have you come?" A voice boomed, deep and resonant, as if the forest itself was speaking. Wanja stepped forward, her bravado finally faltering. "We didn't mean any harm," she stammered. "We were just curious." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then it spoke again. "Curiosity has a price. Will you pay it?" None of us knew what to say. The air grew colder, and the faint glow of the markings on the tree intensified. I felt a pressure in my chest, a sense of being weighed and judged. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "We're sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "We didn't know. Please let us go." For a long moment, There was only silence. Then, the figure lowered its arm. "Leave," it commanded, "and never return." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, not caring which direction we were going as long as it was away from the clearing. The forest seemed to resist us, its roots and branches clawing at our feet and clothes. But eventually, we broke through the tree line and stumbled back into the village. The festival was still in full swing, the lively sounds and warm lights a stark contrast to the terror we had just experienced. We didn't speak of what had happened that night, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. But the warnings of the elders took on a new weight. To this day, I can still hear the faint whistling whenever the wind rustles through the trees. It's a reminder of the night we ventured into the whistling forest, and the spirits that dwell within. And though I've grown older and moved away from Quijora, the memory remains, a haunting echo of a lesson learned too late. When I was a boy growing up in the village of Makono, the elders always told us one thing: never stray into the Wanjala forest after dark. They said it was the dwelling place of restless spirits, guardians of the ancient trees, and those who ventured too far would never return. Of course, as children, we'd whisper about the stories, daring each other to go closer to the forest's edge, but none of us ever had the courage to cross that invisible boundary. That is, until the night everything changed. It was the middle of the harvest season, and everyone in the village was busy preparing for the festival of Gikuha, a time to give thanks to the gods for the bounty of the land. My uncle, Omari, was in charge of gathering special herbs from the outskirts of Wanjala forest, herbs that were said to bring good fortune when burned during the festival. He was a brave man, known for his skill in hunting and his unshakable belief in the spirits. But even he was careful never to step beyond the forest's edge. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Omari returned to the village looking pale and shaken. He carried the herbs, but his usual confidence was gone. When my mother asked him what had happened, he refused to speak, muttering only, "I've seen something I cannot explain." That night, he locked himself in his hut, and strange whispers seemed to drift from the direction of the forest. Curiosity got the better of me. I was 16 at the time, old enough to think I knew everything, but still naive enough to take unnecessary risks. I convinced my best friend, Juma, to come with me to the forest to see what had frightened my uncle. We armed ourselves with a lantern, a knife, and a bundle of charms my grandmother had given me for protection. She had warned us, "If you hear the trees speak, do not answer. And if you see a spirit, do not run. Show respect." The walk to the forest was uneventful, the village's flickering oil lamps growing smaller behind us. The Wanjala forest loomed ahead, its ancient trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and grab at the light. As we stepped closer, the air grew colder, and the usual sounds of crickets and night birds faded into an eerie silence. "Maybe we should turn back," Juma whispered, but I shook my head. "We've come this far. Don't you want to know what's out there?" We ventured deeper, the forest's canopy swallowing the moonlight. The path became harder to follow, but we pressed on, the lantern's glow our only guide. Then we heard it, a soft rustling, like someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush. We froze, hearts pounding. The sound grew louder, and then it stopped. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no reply, but the air grew heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her skin shimmered like the surface of a river under the moonlight, and her eyes glowed an unnatural green. She was draped in what appeared to be vines and leaves, her hair flowing like water. Juma and I stared, too stunned to move. "Why have you come?" she asked, her voice echoing as if 100 voices spoke in unison. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. "Show respect." I lowered my gaze and knelt, pulling Juma down with me. "We mean no harm," I said. "We only wish to understand what frightened my uncle." The woman stepped closer, and the air grew colder still. "Your uncle trespassed where he should not have," she said. "The forest is not kind to those who forget its rules." She raised her hand, and the forest seemed to come alive. The trees groaned and shifted, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Whispers filled the air, voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. Juma clutched my arm, his breath ragged. Please, I said, my voice trembling. We will leave. We will tell the village to honor the forest and its spirits. The woman studied us for a moment, her glowing eyes piercing into my soul. Then she smiled, though it was not a comforting expression. Very well, she said, but remember this. The forest watches. If you forget your promise, it will not be so forgiving. With that, she dissolved into a swirl of leaves, and the forest fell silent once more. Juma and I wasted no time. We ran, the lantern swinging wildly until we broke through the edge of the forest and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The next day, we told the village what had happened. My uncle finally spoke, confirming that he too had seen the spirit. The elders held a ceremony, offering food, milk, and prayers to the forest spirits, begging for their forgiveness and protection. From that day on, no one dared to venture into Wanjala Forest without reason. The festival of Gikuha became not only a celebration of the harvest, but also a time to honor the spirits that guarded our land. And though I have since left Makono, I still carry the memory of that night, a chilling reminder of the power and mystery of the Wanjala Forest. I was only 19 when I started working as a nursing assistant at the Mwadama Community Hospital. It wasn't much more than a modest building with cracked walls and faded paint. But to the surrounding villages, it was a lifeline. The maternity ward, in particular, was always bustling with life and activity. That's where I worked, day and night shifts, helping bring new life into the world. But the ward had a darker history, one that wasn't often spoken about aloud. The elders called it the Crying Ward, though its real name was Ward C. They said decades ago, during a time of famine, the ward had been used to house dying children, victims of malnutrition and disease. Their cries, some said, still lingered in the air, especially during the night. I brushed off the rumors as village superstition until my third night shift. It was around 2 a.m., and the hospital was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the generator. I was making rounds, checking on the few patients we had that night. 2 mothers slept soundly in the ward with their newborns cradled beside them. I remember smiling at the sight. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I was filling out a chart at the nurse's station when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched wail. It wasn't unusual to hear babies crying, but this sound was different. It carried a chilling quality, like it was coming from somewhere far away but still very present. I glanced at the mothers. Their babies were sound asleep. I stood up, my heart pounding, and followed the sound down the hallway. The cry grew louder as I approached an old storage room at the far end of the corridor. This room hadn't been used in years. Its door was always locked, and it held dusty equipment no one bothered to move. But that night, the door was slightly ajar. The air grew colder as I stepped closer. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the persistent sound of crying. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The old hospital beds and wheelchairs were exactly where they had always been, covered in layers of dust. But in the corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, shadowy figure crouched on the floor, rocking back and forth. The crying was coming from it. I froze, unable to speak or move. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, and though its face was shrouded in darkness, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. "Why did you leave us?" A childlike voice whispered, filled with anguish. I stumbled back, slamming into the doorframe. The figure dissolved into the air, and the crying abruptly stopped. The room was silent once more, but the oppressive cold lingered. I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart racing. When I told my supervisor about what I'd seen, she simply nodded, her face pale. "You've heard the cries now?" she said softly. "It happens to everyone who works here long enough. The spirits of the children, those who didn't survive, still linger. They don't mean harm, they just want to be acknowledged." From that night on, I couldn't ignore the stories. I began to notice the little things, the faint sound of laughter in empty halls, the scent of wildflowers where none had been placed, and the occasional soft cry echoing in the night. The elders advised us to leave small offerings, milk, porridge, or flowers, in the storage room to appease the restless spirits. We did, and for the most part, the cries grew less frequent. But one night, just before dawn, I heard something that stayed with me forever. I was finishing up my rounds when I passed by the storage room again. This time, the door wasn't ajar. It was wide open. Inside, the same cold air greeted me, but the room looked different. The dust seemed to have been disturbed, and there were faint footprints leading to the center of the room. Then, I heard it. Soft humming, like a lullaby. I stepped inside, clutching my flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw a group of children sitting in a circle, their faces turned toward me. They looked neither happy nor angry, just sad. And then, in unison, they whispered, "Remember us." I dropped the flashlight and stumbled out, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know why, but their words hit me like a wave of sorrow. I left an offering outside the door and stayed away from the storage room for weeks. Even now, years later, I can't forget the feeling of their presence. The hospital's elders always said that the past never truly leaves us, and in the case of Ward C, they were right. The cries, the whispers, and the sadness of the forgotten children linger in the walls of Mwatima Community Hospital, a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the spirits left behind.